Welcome to my YouTube channel, Surowicz Watercolor. At any time during this video, you can click on the link in the lower right hand corner to subscribe to my channel. Do you struggle to maintain a bead when applying a wash? One of the most effective methods for applying an even wash in watercolor is to lead a bead of paint down your page or across the shape or area that you want to apply the wash in. It's much more effective and gives a more consistent result than taking a damp brush and trying to fill in the space like you're painting a house. When you're leading a bead of paint, the actual bead that you're leading coats the paper and doesn't rely on the brush to force the paint into all the textural areas of the paper. That bead just gives a nice coating as you lead it down your page. And because dry paper will resist the flow of the paint, you can stay in control of what happens to that bead by leading it with your brush. When using this technique, sometimes people struggle to get enough moisture down on the paper to create a bead. They find their brush runs out before they even get close to generating a bead that they can lead on their paper. My suggestion is to start to practice this by working very small, and once you can accomplish putting a wash down with a bead in a very small area, then start to grow the space that you're doing that in, because the technique will not change. So if you look at this example that's up on the screen, this is a 8 by 10 sheet of watercolor paper, so it's not very large. And the two smaller squares in the top left hand corner are only 1.5 inches by 1.5 inches square. In this video tip, I'm going to demonstrate, starting with the smaller squares, how you can lead a bead of water and how to maintain that bead of water. And this is something you can do practicing on scraps of paper in a small space. And if you can do it in a small space, you can do the same thing in a larger space. So that's what I'm going to do in this demonstration. We'll start with a small, then we'll move to a little bit larger area, then a little larger area, and then the largest area. But they'll all use the same technique. Here we have a closer view of the two small squares in the top left corner. These are 1.5 inches square, and I'm using a small number 4 round brush for what I'm going to be doing here. And in the first square on the left, I'm going to paint this in a manner that is least desirable. You don't want to paint this just randomly, fill in the space like you're painting a wall in a room in your house. And you can see I don't have a bead, so I'm using the brush to try and cover the paper, and I have to go back over the area a few times to try and get the coverage so that I can get my wash down. So this would be a less desirable approach than what we're going to do on the right side. Because this is a very small area, it stays wet and smooths over some of the rough brush strokes that I made. If I were working on a larger area with this technique, it would be hard to do without some of those brush strokes being visible in my wash. Now I'm going to move to the second square, and in this one we're going to use a bead of water. We're using the same brush and the same mixture, and I'm going to put a brush stroke across the top. And you can see that I've got a bead of water of my paint mixture starting to accumulate at the bottom of the area that is wet. So you can see that bead there. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to lead that bead down. And when I load my brush up and bring it back to the paper, I add to that bead. And I can go back into the brush stroke and dispense more paint into that area that is wet, and it's going to collect at the bottom of that area where the paper is wet. And the dry paper won't allow that bead to move any farther unless you completely tip your board up at an extreme angle or put way too much moisture into that area that's wet. eventually that bead can break. But I'm at about a 20-degree angle, and you can see that bead of water goes nowhere. And I can just lead that down the page, and the bead itself is coating the paper. It's not the bristles of my brush. And you can see that I can get a very smooth wash, just very smooth coverage as I lead that down that shape. So on this block on the right, I let the bead of, I'll refer to it as water even though it's a paint mixture, but I let the bead of water do the work as I let it down the page. Now one of the things you want to make sure of when you're going to do an area like this, especially a large area, you want to make sure you mix up enough of your paint so that you can cover the whole area if you're trying to apply a flat wash, so you don't get a lot of variation. So now we're going to grow our space a little bit, and we're going to put a bead of water along the top of this rectangle, which is the width of the two shapes combined above. I'm going to be using the same technique, and you can see how my brush runs out of enough moisture to put down a bead. And this is where some people struggle. They say, I can't get enough moisture. Well, you can load your brush again and come back into that brush mark until you start to develop a bead. I can just load my brush so it's holding as much paint as it can hold, and when I touch it to the paper, it distributes that paper or that paint into the paper without brushing it. It doesn't require me moving the brush to release the moisture when my brush is fully loaded. So you have to make sure you fully load your brush so it's holding as much as it can hold, and it's actually putting moisture down almost like an eyedropper at that point. Now you can see the large bead that I have there, and when I go back and recharge my brush and come back to it, it will keep that bead. But I could also not reload my brush, and once I start get closer to the bottom, I'll stop reloading my brush and I'll just take what's in that bead and bring it down till I get full coverage. So right now I don't need to reload my brush because there's enough water in that bead to cover. And then when I'm done and I have a bead at the bottom, I'll take my brush and I'll pick up that excess. So I'll use a tissue, take the moisture out of my brush, and touch it to the paper, and it will absorb the excess. Hopefully you can see how we got nice even coverage and we let that bead do all the work. Now we're going to move down to the bottom box, which is a larger space. It's just as wide, but now it's a longer area, so it's a square once again, and I've grown my brush a little bit. So I'm using about a number 8 round brush, but the technique is the same. Fully loading my brush, creating a bead of water, and then I'm bringing it down over my shape, and I'm letting the bead do the work. And whenever I want, I can load my brush and touch it into the area where the paper is wet, and that moisture in my brush will release down onto the paper and recharge my bead. And one of the things that's important when you're doing large areas, especially if you're cutting around shapes with a wash, you want to maintain that bead because it will allow you to pause and go and work in other areas or work around shapes without creating an edge. If you don't maintain a bead when you're bringing a wash down around shapes, that wash is going to start to set an edge, and when you go to continue it, it's going to leave you an irregular edge rather than just continue a smooth wash like this. So I can put that bead there and let it sit for a while if I need to. Not too long. I'm just talking enough time to work around some other shapes. And there again, so we have full coverage, and I'm going to come back, pick up the excess moisture. If you let that moisture just sit there, eventually that's going to start to dry, and it's going to backwash up into the areas that have become dry. Now I'm going to move to the larger shape, and I'm going to be using a larger brush. I'll be using a large round wash brush. You wouldn't want to do this with a little brush. It would just take too long to cover this area. and the technique doesn't change because I'm working in a larger area and using a larger brush. So this is a very soft brush. It holds a lot of paint, and you can start to see that bead form, and now you can see how much moisture I can just load into that. It's just this bead of paint that is going to do the work for us. It's going to give a nice even coverage, and you can see how that bead doesn't move. If I put too much into that bead and then tipped it up at a steep angle, it would eventually break loose and roll down the page. But the angle I'm working at and the loading, that's not a concern. When you take, if you were painting this area with a small brush, and like I refer to it as like painting a wall, no bead, but just trying to paint this area in, you're going to start to get brush strokes. The paper is going to start to dry in areas while it's wet in others. You could get backwash. This is a more effective technique for applying a wash, leaving this bead. And if you want a wash with multiple colors, you can just start changing what you're loading in your brush, just as you would any other time when you're painting. But you can see you get nice even coverage. I've mixed a nice pool of paint so I have enough to cover the area. And this is no different than working in the small area. So my recommendation is to start working on small shapes if this is something that you don't have the proficiency with that you want. Just practice with a small brush in small space, maintaining a bead, and then replicate that process in a larger scale, working in a larger space with a larger brush. And this works also with a flat brush. It doesn't have to be a round brush. I hope you enjoyed this tip. Thanks for watching. If you want to subscribe to my channel, or if you want to see more videos, you can click on the boxes that are appearing on the screen.